What's going on, folks? Nate here at Tool Dyno Works, and I am just wrapping up our stock exhaust and intake modification testing for our new GSX8 that I've got here behind me on the dyno. Now, as you can see from the outside, this thing is bone stock. The stock exhaust is still in place. We've done some intake work that you can do in your garage with some hand tools in just a few minutes, and with our ECU flash, the performance improvements, even with a stock exhaust in place, are fucking huge. Now, we've seen some other folks talk about intake modifications for these bikes, but we went ahead and found some additional improvements, so we took it a step further, and let's dive right into it. This is our bike's baseline run on the dyno. It is in bone stock configuration here. Stock mapping, stock intake, stock exhaust makes 76 horsepower, 53 foot-pounds of torque to the tire on pump gas. Which, by the way, already blows the doors off of any of the Yamaha products in this group, whether it's the R7, the MT-07, the FT-07, the Tenere 700, the XSR 700, all of which we flashed thousands times over the years. This is better, even bone stock. If we take a look at run 35 there, that is still the bone stock intake, the bone stock exhaust system, but we went ahead and made some tweaks to the ECU. I'll be completely honest with you here, there's plenty of fuel in the system from the factory. This is mostly ignition timing gains, which is why you're seeing from about 5,500 up, you're gaining about 2 horsepower pretty much everywhere, and that's mostly from ignition timing manipulation because, well, Suzuki left a little bit on the table in that regard. Now, 2 horsepower everywhere, but 5,500 is cool. There's actually like 3 horsepower if you look at like 8,500 RPMs, but let's take a look at the intake modification work we've done and what we've been able to accomplish with that. And there you have it. The green run there, run 30, is with our intake work done to the bike with the stock exhaust still in place and our ECU mapping to match. Peak power is now 82 horsepower. It is 59.5 foot-pounds of torque, and the gains through the mid-range are fucking huge. Now here I went ahead and removed what we've managed to do with the stock intake still in place so we can look at this bike bone stock, which is run 4, versus the intake modifications we've done and our custom ECU flash, which is run 30. We've gone there in the meat of the RPM range from around 73 horsepower to almost 82. That is a 8 to 9 horsepower improvement and a 5 to 6 foot-pound of torque improvement in the same portion of the RPM range. Which means that from bone stock to the intake modification I'm about to show you how to do and our ECU flash, you just gained an additional 10 to 13% more power throughout the entire meat of the RPM range and torque. Okay, so how do we do the intake modifications? Well, flip the camera around here and I'll show you. When you go ahead and pop the seat off of your GSX8 or GSX8R, whatever the hell you've got, you're going to see this airbox lid and these snorkels stuck in either side. You don't actually have to pull this intake lid out whatsoever. It's sitting right here on top of the filter, and the snorkels go on either side underneath the plastics. Other videos show you to remove the battery. You actually don't need to do any of that. I literally just grabbed them and yanked them out of the airbox lid. Easy peasy. Now, that got us quite a bit more power right off the bottom and through the mid-range, but there's also an additional step that needs to be taken to fully maximize this bike's stock airbox. And that is this piece of foam that you're going to see sitting right on top of the air filter from the factory. That needs to go. That is there purely for noise emissions. This is doing you nothing. This filter media is not going to save you from any debris intrusion that this filter is not going to catch already. Now, removing that foam, I guess you can call it a filter, and the snorkels is essentially the extent of what other folks out there have recommended for intake modifications. There is one additional step that you need to take to create more power than what those 2 modifications alone are going to allow for. If you pull the filter out of the airbox and turn it over, you're going to see a big metal screen on the back of it. These have been in place in several other bikes over the years, and they're incredibly easy to remove. Just grab a flathead screwdriver, pop them off of each of the pins, and then just to make sure there's no debris that gets in the airbox, I went ahead and actually cut the pins off just with a pair of dikes. That way there's no little nubbins hanging out that can possibly get sucked in, and pop it back on, reassemble the top of the airbox without the snorkels, and you're set. Not removing that final piece on the back of the airbox, that metal mesh, will hold you back a couple of horsepower through the mid-range. So definitely do all 3 of those intake modifications once you get your new GSX8. Again, whether it's the S, the R, the V-Strom, same engine, same ECU, this applies to all of them. Yank the snorkels, go ahead and remove the foam from the top of the air filter, flip the air filter over, and cut off the metal mesh. Reinstall, and you're good to go once you get your ECU flashed. Now, I'm sure a lot of people are going to ask, well, what if you don't want to flash the ECU and just do the intake mods? There's plenty of fuel in the stock mapping to accommodate for it. You don't need to flash the ECU to do those modifications, but a lot of the top-end improvement does come from ignition timing, which you can't obviously have with a stock ECU still in stock configuration. You will also then find that the bike is a little lurchy. from the factory once you've done those modifications, because it does start to get pretty darn lean at light throttle. Again, there's plenty of fuel in the system in the stock ECU mapping at wide open throttle, but at light throttle and just cruising idle everywhere in that range, it's pretty freaking lean, which is standard for most of the Euro 5 models. So you'll definitely benefit hugely from our ECU flash for whatever setup you decide to go with. But again, I highly recommend performing all 3 steps of this intake mod to maximize your airbox's performance. And obviously with our ECU flash, there's also much more to it than just ignition timing modification and fuel mapping changes for whatever intake and exhaust modification you decide to make for your bike. I've also completely overhauled the throttle-by-wire mapping that comes in this bike from the factory. These bikes come with 3 rider modes. So you have A, B, and C, and the A mode is supposed to be your most aggressive from the factory. It still leaves a lot to be desired. It is a very soft throttle through most of the RPM range. The first half of it feels kind of dead in my opinion. So I've made it a much more linear and more responsive throttle. It's not snatchy by any means, so it's going to jerk you around, but it makes for a much more linear throttle response. And especially if you're coming from a standard cable throttle application, you're going to like that a hell of a lot more than the stock throttle-by-wire mapping that's in A mode. B mode only made some minor tweaks too, and it's very similar to A mode from the factory. So B mode is just going to be a little bit smoother than it was previously, and C mode I've just left stock. In all modes, we disable the fuel cut on deceleration, and we also go ahead and eliminate the fault codes for the O2 sensor in the air injection system, which you do have to A, unplug the O2 sensor, and B, plug or block off the air injection system. I've covered how to do both those things in a previous video that I'll also go ahead and link in the description. Now, obviously, there's a lot more work to be done here because this stock exhaust system is hideous. That catalytic converter is heavy, this thing gets hot, and it's gotta go. There's not a tremendous number of exhaust systems yet available for this bike, which is actually why I waited about a month or so from when I first thought about buying this to going ahead and pulling the trigger and getting one for the shop to start working on R&D. Because when I first saw this bike come out, the only exhaust system out there was an Acura, and the full Krapovich exhaust system retails for $1,500. Now, I do have that on the way. I also have 2 other exhaust systems on the way from manufacturers that have not yet publicly announced that they've made systems for these bikes. We're going to go ahead and get some early prototypes anyway, and I'll go ahead and get those installed and get you some performance numbers so we can actually give you an honest comparison, because again, I'm completely unbiased. I don't actually care which system performs the best, so I will absolutely give you that unbiased and honest feedback on what exhaust system outperforms the others, and take a look at the price points, and then I can make an honest recommendation on which one I'd recommend going with. But regardless of which one you go with, we'll have custom mapping built for it. Because just like the FZ07s, the MT07s, all the Yamaha CP2 platform in the past that we flashed thousands of over the years, we're really invested in this platform. So no matter what intake and exhaust combination comes out on the market, we're going to have this bike for a long time. We'll be buying a lot of intake and exhaust systems, and we'll be doing a lot of testing and ECU mapping R&D over the years as products come out for these. It's also worth noting that the intake modifications are definitely not done, not by a long shot for these bikes. This is going to be another situation where some velocity stack modification and potentially some airbox lid modification will net you some additional improvements, and we'll obviously be covering that as they become available. I won't give you exact numbers, but I did go ahead actually and remove some additional intake components, like the airbox lid, for example, and there is additional power increases to be had when you do that, but you can't do that, so I'm not going to show you how, because if you were to do that, then there's no way for the filter to stay in place, and then all of a sudden you don't have a filtered intake, which is silly. But the point is, there is additional performance to be had on the intake side of these bikes over and above what you can do just here in your garage that I've shown you how to do with hand tools in about 90 seconds. Our ECU flash for these bikes is going to be up on our website for $329.99. Now, we are going into the holidays, and we always do have a holiday sale every year. So we will be offering a 10% discount on all of our ECU flashing through the end of the year. So if you do want to go ahead and jump on some modifications for your new GSX, again, whether that's the S model, or you're buying an R, or you've got the V-Strom 800, because I can't stress this enough, it's all the same engine and ECU, same intake, same modifications are necessary to uncork it. It's the same restricted setup, no matter which one you have. We'd be happy to get it flashed and tuned and dialed in for you. And if you have any questions whatsoever when it comes to modifications or tuning for this platform, do not hesitate to send us an email at support@toolironworks.com. We are always happy to help.